Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, praised is the judge of truth. With those words, we begin each funeral with a declaration that life, despite the randomness of it, has meaning and purpose, and that we pledge ourselves to that meaning and purpose. Adonai Natan v'Adonai Lekach, Yehi Shem Adonai Mevarach. God gives and God takes, and through it all, we bless God's name. We say yes to life. It's traditional at a time of parting such as this to recite words from the book of Psalms, which have given the Jewish people comfort for countless time. I call up at this moment Cantor Gary Paller to share with us a chanting from the book of Psalms.
Esaenai el harim me'ayin yavo Ezri me'im Adonai Usei shamayim va'aretz Aitein lamot raglecha al yanum shumrecha Hine lo yanum v'lo yishan shomer Yisrael Adonai Shumrecha Adonai Tzilcha Al Yad Yeminecha Yom HaShemesh lo yakeka ve'yareach balayla Adonai yishmorcha mikol Yishmor et nafshecha Adonai yishmor tzeitcha uvoecha me'ata ve'ad olam me'ata ve'ad
In times of trouble and travail, where will my help come from? I look to the mountain, to the high places, to the Creator. Friends, we're here to remember and commemorate and celebrate the life of Lori Beth Solomon, beloved daughter to Natalie Barr and her predeceased father, Morden Solomon. Sam Barr, also deceased, her stepfather. Beloved sister to Gary and Marilyn, to Stephen and Susan, to Ted and Cheryl Barr, brother Mitchell Barr, beloved partner of David Bruning, loving aunt, to so many. In a moment, we'll hear words from Lori's brother, Stephen. And before we hear from Steve, let me just begin with words from her aunt Stephanie, from her niece Stephanie, with these words of tribute. Lori had a spirit that wanted to fly and learn and explore, see the world, change the world, challenge authority, blaze a trail. Lori had a body that kept her chained to the ground, made her lose, made her need, made her sacrifice, and more. But still, Lori fought. She loved, she danced, she laughed. I will never forget your strength and warrior spirit. I learned from you how to be a powerful woman. You may not have been able to change all you dreamt of, but you changed me. The words, the loving words of a niece. If I could call Steve at this time to share recollection.
I was, this is just a story from the beginning of her life where Lori was born in April of '61, and the day that she was coming home from the hospital with my mom and my dad and my grandmother were in the back of the car, I had spilkas. I didn't want to wait. My brother and I walked up to the corner of our street to wait while the car came, and we saw them coming in the car. My dad was very upset with us because we had walked up to the corner. We wanted to see our sister. We adored her. You know, I was 6.5. Gary was 9, and there was this little bundle, and we got home, and we had this huge banner across the garage that said, "Welcome home, Mom and Lori." And it just, I always think back to that. I mean, that she was just such a vital, intelligent, and fiercely independent woman. Lori was, and I never thought that I'd be here before her. And I just wanted to tell you that story.
Touching story of beginnings in the life of Lori. Beth Solomon was born April 16, 1961. Chaya Tova, Bat Mendel Shmuel Ve'asna. Beloved sister, as we see, to Gary and Marilyn and Steve and Susan, and to their children, Mark and Jessica and Stephanie and Michael and Jake, Mitch Barr and Ted Barr and Cheryl and their children, Adam and Ben, Drew, Annie. She was a beloved aunt, a beloved sister, a beloved friend, a beloved daughter. And one of the themes that will wend its way throughout my recollections is really that of someone who had mastered the art of friendship, whether it was with her friend Rona Cardner, with whom she worked in the Jewish Federation of Cleveland, but who was a college friend, or one of the Lauries, one of the two Lauries, Laurie Beth Giuliani, who was, by the way, really a member of the family, one of Aunt Helen's chicks. Her beloved Dave Bruning, supporting, loving partner over the last half a decade. Her lifelong friend, Sherry, actor Winter, and so many other friends who may go unmentioned here, but that is because of my ignorance and not because of your lack of importance to Laurie. Despite that, there's a couple of special mentions I want to begin with. Marilyn, first of all, for everything that you did to take care of your sister-in-law in this final period. And it's actually highlighted because you're the older woman who stole her beloved brother from her. And while there might have been a little bit of jealousy on Laurie's part in the very early days, it never impacted your relationship. And Marilyn took care of so many things as Laurie became more incapable of handling themselves, whether it was tasks like driving or the bills or medical care or organizing the many pills, setting up a phone alarm to take the pills. A sister-in-law who was a sister. And Dave, I have to give you special mention, because Dave knew from the outset, as some of the older friends and family knew that this was a woman with epilepsy, and as one of the family members mentioned, you jumped right into the team without hesitation. And yet, that was not what defined your relationship. Was the way you built a life together, your hiking, your theater, your many activities, getting her even to sing karaoke. She was not much of a singer, I understand. The large circle of friends that you nurtured. And special thanks, of course, to her next-door neighbor, Debbie, who, of course, is somehow behind the scenes, pulling the strings that got you to at least to know one another before you ran into one another as well. And therefore also special mention to Debbie Tannenbaum, her neighbor in Columbus, and her shomeret, the woman who found Laurie's body after she had passed and stayed with her with such sensitivity and diligence, stayed with her body until the funeral home could come and take her, and watched over her in the way of the faithful. Laurie was not yet 52, a couple months away from that. And so people have asked me, as they often do, of what did she die? And I think we all know, if we scratch the surface a little bit, that the real question is never of what did we die, but how did she live? And that, I suppose, is the role of a eulogy, to try to show us how, to answer the how of our lives. At the same time, there's an old prayer that you can find in some prayer books, in some sidorim, traditionally recited before the chanting of Psalms. Ve'al techacheni me'olam hazeh kodem zmani. Please, God, don't take us from this world before our time. And so we have to ask, how did she die? Because we all wished that she had more time as well. Laurie had epilepsy, as I'm sure most of us are aware. And she, in many ways, was very fortunate because she had a full 2 decades in which it was under control, in which she was seizure-free. And then in the last year, 14 months or so, in my time knowing you, Natalie, the seizures returned with a vengeance. But in between that, we have the how of her life, and we know what a powerful spokesperson she was for those with epilepsy, how she spoke of the Epilepsy Foundation in Columbus, how she taught about it in her classes, and how she taught most profoundly and most truly, I think, that she was not an epileptic, but someone who had epilepsy. our humanity always exceeds our infirmities. Correct? Our humanity exceeds our infirmities. And so it begs the larger question then of what is a life for? How should we use our time? And what is our root soul, the nature, the individual essence of who we are? How is it supposed to express its unique humanity? As it says in the book of Bereshit of Genesis, Vayichi Yaakov, Jacob lived. And so too, Lori lived. So let us go back to her childhood, her happy childhood, her childhood with two doting older brothers, a childhood in which she loved to dance, tap, ballet, and of course, she had to be a Girl Scout, someone as in love with people as Lori was. In fact, Natalie shared this wonderful image of her house entirely filled up with Girl Scout cookies. So I know that Lori, with her drive and ambition, took that quite seriously to have enough cookies to fill the house. And a childhood filled with the gifts of friendship, of Sherry Actor Winter making that friend in childhood who would last her throughout her life, a member of her Jewish youth group, a happy childhood, and then her father died. And it struck her as anyone who had a wonderful and loving relationship with her father with difficulty. And yet, or perhaps, or because of, she became that image of a fighter, of someone who embraced life, as Stephanie so beautifully shared in her words. And I think again of that lifelong friend of Sherry Winter, friend since elementary school, there throughout everything, the best of friends throughout life. And I think that very often that term best of friends has something strange about it, that the accident of time of someone who knew us earlier should somehow elevate us. And yet the preciousness of walking through life together, of carrying shared memories and experiences, of being there with one another through all that life has to offer, is one of the greatest possessions that any of us can have. Lori was a good student. She graduated from Mayfield High and went on first to Ohio University and then completing her BA at Baldwin Wallace, where she earned her degree in political science and international relations. And those were two abiding passions and concerns and interests and areas of motivation for her throughout her life. And then she went on to Case Western University in the Mandel School of Social Work, where she earned her master's degree in nonprofit management. And that degree in nonprofit management filled a great many of her working years. Because yes, while she was still in undergrad years or so, the dates are a little bit in haze, but she worked as a librarian at South Euclid. But after that, she worked at United Way, first as a volunteer, fitting of someone whose charge in life was to make a difference and to make the world better, and then as a paid employee in the area of development. And she continued in development for many years after that, working at the Jewish Federation of Cleveland, and then moving down to Columbus, where the latter half of her life was spent. And she worked at the Federation of Columbus there from 2000 to 2012. And then, I suppose, as the economy racked so many people's lives, and as corporations and institutions sought to become leaner, that job that she loved so much disappeared as the Federation tried to pull its belt tighter. But Lori, never a quitter, got out there and hustled and put together means, even at that point, working as teaching as an adjunct professor at OSU, at Columbus State, and a capital university. And interestingly, it was not in her experiences in development and fundraising. It was not that. It went back to her earlier love of political science and international relations from her younger days. And while at Capitol, she helped develop a model UN. And I have to tell you, I am well familiar with this because my brother-in-law has set up model UNs throughout the world, and their impact on students is profound in terms of giving them confidence in their own notions and being able to be part of the world, and to say that politics is not something out there, but something we each can take a role in. She built it from nothing and took her students there to San Francisco for one of the big UN model UN conventions. And if anyone here is from Capital University, it occurred to me, if you would take that program and make sure it continues to grow and to thrive, it would be a very fitting tribute to Lori's life. So she taught politics in the end. It makes sense. The woman who used to canvass people door to door for Ohio Public Interest, arguing for clean air and water, knocking everyone's door with her friendly personality, making her pitch. And she campaigned for Sherrod Brown, and even at the end of her life, she was making calls for President Obama during his campaign, despite her own health issues. If she had the strength, she used it for something that mattered for her. And that is even in some ways more remarkable because she helped others long after she had tried her own political career. When she was a Cleveland girl, she was a very proud resident of Cleveland Heights and ran there for city council. She worked hard at that campaign, really campaigned actively. And while it did not occur, she certainly was out in the marketplace. And Natalie reminded me about these cookies they'd bake in different colors, or beige cookies, different cookies that represented her love of multiculturalism, of ethnic diversity, of the dream of America in which everyone can find his or her place, and ultimately how that spoke of her great values and concern for dignity and respect of all people. And I suppose that's why when she had a chance to make a dream come true, to go to Africa, that she did, that this abiding interest in the birthplace of civilization and of humanity was just this fascination. And so in the year 2000 or so, she was actually able to bring that dream to fruition and travel to Zimbabwe and Tanzania and South Africa. Dignity and respect for all. This brings us, my friends, full circle to something touched upon earlier about her root soul, about how Lori lived, her values, dignity, the value and integrity of each person, so paramount to her, and with it, the importance of independence, that we each have a right and a duty to carve out a place for ourselves in the world. And she had that love of independence, clung to it fiercely, even as she was losing it. She didn't want to be a burden on anyone else. Her doctor informed her that she had to go on disability, and she said, no, there's so many people who really need it more than I do, even though she needed it. And I was reminded of a phrase by the great Southern American writer of the South, Eudora Welty, who says, we spend our whole life and childhood fighting to gain independence, only then to face its loss. Where did she get this from? Was she born this way? Those are questions we can't fully answer, but surely Aunt Helen, her dad's sister, has to play a part of it. Early on, in a different time, Aunt Helen lived her life with such independence, single until her 70s, and she was really sort of a surrogate second mother. Not that anyone needs a second mother with someone like Natalie, but another role model for Lori in terms of how to live. And her sense of dignity, of that values, I suppose, played itself out in the causes and interests that motivated and lighted Laurie's life up. She was a feminist, believing in the right of women to embrace any sort of what at one point would have been considered non-traditional roles. She'd brought an orange to the Seder plate, for those who may not know, a symbol in recent times that speaks just that each person should be allowed to have a place at the table. And yet I have known from my own readings in feminism in my 20s how many people in that desire to forge a place for everyone, sometimes in that very act can succumb to rancor or anger or bitterness about what is not yet. But not Laurie. Not Laurie. Whether it was her veganism for health reasons, she did not allow what concerned her to interfere with the greatest value, which was the neshama, the soul of another person. And so, Gary, you and Laurie could have these friendly political, rivalry that would go on for years on different part of the spectrum, and yet that brotherly and sisterly love was never in any way impinged by that. And you would all gather the family for Hanukkah and Pesach and Sukkot. And for those, Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, when Jews build little huts and live outside them, quite boldly in Ohio, I might add, in the season, was so dear to her. And she even made sure to get a kit online. And Gary would go, even in her modest apartment, and they'd build it on this little concrete pad next to the building. And they would celebrate. They celebrated their life. And how you put together this wonderful sort of virtual space on Google Plus to create virtual family hangouts, so that when it was not the time of these family gatherings, the family still was together in all the ways that are possible when we live such far-flung lives. Laurie had another secret. She had a great sense of humor, and she knew how to find the humorous in life. She was a loving person, extremely loving to family and to friends, the value of family. And boy, did she have guts. Even once the seizures returned, she would walk to Capital University, which was within walking distance to her house, but the weather notwithstanding, on a very hot day, she would just walk because that's who she was. She wasn't going to let an illness define her humanity. Laurie was strongly and proudly identified with her people, with her Jewish background. After all, so much of her working life was for the Federation, the Jewish federations up here and in Columbus, which aimed to build a better life for Jews and for the larger community, and to provide so much for those in need. But she also loved the culture, the practices, that sukkah, the communal aspects that brought people together. It's a line in Kohelet. Mikra echad yikra et kulam. One fate falls all of us. And in a shortened life, lacking in the fullness of years we might wish for, that we might imagine we are due, we are tempted, perhaps, to cry out with the unfairness as life, as though years were the measure of a person. But we're not in charge of how much life we get, and we're not really in charge of how we die. We are in charge of how we live. And Laurie lived, first and foremost, with friendship and relationship at the front of her being. We're wowed when we look in the papers by people of accomplishments, people who are effective in the world. And Laurie, as we have noted, was that. And that is as it should be. We should use our time and try to achieve and accomplish. But it seems to me, in my experience and in the privilege of a rabbi's office, that perhaps the greatest and sometimes most overlooked accomplishment of a human being is having proper mental health and full human development so that you can fully bond and connect and love other human beings. And there are people with tremendous accomplishments who lack that basic development, that basic ability to find themselves a place in the world. In Bereshit, in the book of Genesis, we read in the story of Joseph, Nafsho kshura v'nafsho. His soul was bound up in another soul. That was Lori. That was the quality of her relationships, bound up in other people's lives. And so they were bound up in her life. And therefore I must turn now to one whose soul was intrinsically and deeply bound up with Lori's, her mother. Natalie, your dedication to Lori stretches far beyond what I know, but in our time, the stories you would tell me of reaching out, your tremendous concern, the worries that a mother must always carry for a child, your trips down to Columbus to care for her, and now today, on the day of this impossible, terrible loss. We're speechless, and I am speechless. I suppose because I wish that words had some ability to wave a magic wand, like a magic potion, and lessen the pain or make it disappear. But that's not love's way, and it's not the way of love's loss either. And so what I can say to you on this terrible day is that we are all here for you. And this community will bind you up in our bosom as you bound up Lori in your bosom. And let me offer you this too. Life is filled with randomness. It's true. But it is also suffused with connections. Connections we don't always see. And let me share one with you then that comes to mind. I asked you who Lori was named after. And one of the people from which she took the name Tova was Grandma Bubby Saratova. Grandma Sarah, good Sarah, who lived in the made challah in Natalie's mom's house all the time with that smell of challah, and who was there. And you know, among many of Lori's abilities and interests, cooking was not one. You see that? Some of you know. And yet on holidays, what did she do? In Hanukkah, she would make a dreidel bread. She'd make a dreidel bread and she would bake challah. And I think about that. Her name's source, her Bubi Saratova, who baked challah, that passing from one generation to the other, connections that bind us one to the other. Human worth, our accomplishments, our worth, our love, all these define us. But also, as we know, we say at a time like this, Baruch Dayan Emet, praised is the judge of truth. We say, in other words, that despite the difficulties, our life is in front of us, that we have hopes and desires for a future. Rabbi Eliezer, a Talmudic sage from the 3rd century or so, ended his Amidah, the central standing prayer of Judaism, with his own personal prayer. And he said, "May it be your will, O God, that in our lot there dwell love and brotherhood, peace and friendship. To the very end of our lives, may you endow us with hope and expectation. May you sustain us in your world with a good friend and a good impulse." On Monday, Lori had just that blessing. She was hopeful and optimistic about her future. She had plans. She had goals. And that, it seems to me, we might view as a shame that they were not expressed. Or we might, like Rabbi Eliezer, realize that it was the blessing of Lori's life, that she had a chaya tova, a good life like Babi Saratova. May her memory be for a blessing. It is a tradition at times like this to offer gifts of charity in memory of someone, and for those who are so moved, the family recommends making contributions to the Epilepsy Foundation. The central office is in Landover, Maryland. You can certainly find that online. The family will receive friends at the residence of Natalie Barr, which is 1307 Orchard Heights Drive in Mayfield Heights, following interment today until 2 p.m., with Minyan continuing then on Monday from 1 to 5, and then at 7 and 9 with the Minyan with the prayer service at 8 p.m. on Monday. And I hope that you'll be able to support Natalie and her entire family at this difficult time. In a moment, we will end and we will escort Lori's Aron, her casket, to the limousine and hearse outside, and then out to the cemetery to her final resting place. Before we do that, we will rise now for the memorial prayer, which Cantor Gary Paller will chant.
שוכן במרומים, המצא מנוחה נכונה, תחת כנפי השכינה, במעלות קדושים וטהורים, כזוהר הרקיע מזהירים את נשמת חיה טובה בת מנדל שמואל ואזנה, שהלכה לעולמה, בגן עדן תהא מנוחתה. אנא בעל הרחמים, הסתיריה בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתה. אדוני נחלתו ותנוח בשלום, בשלום, על משכבה ונאמר אמן.
El Malei God full of compassion, who dwells in the high places, grant perfect rest and peace beneath the wings of your sheltering presence, among the holy and the pure and the shining, to the soul of Lori, who has gone to her eternal home. God of compassion, we ask that this dear one, this loved one, find perfect peace in your eternal embrace. May her soul be bound up in the bond of life. May she rest in peace. And together let us all say, Amen. The pallbearers will now come forward.